I'm extremely happy and much honored to welcome our first speaker this morning, Professor Tim O'Connor. Tim is Professor of Philosophy at Indiana University, a university which is dear to my heart because that's where the first edition has started, the chronological edition. Yes. Oh, you didn't know? Yes. Okay. So you have to, Tim, there almost your entire career, I think, yeah? Yes. Apart from year-long research fellowships at the universities of Notre Dame, St. Andrews, and Oxford. Your main areas of scholarship are metaphysics, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of religion. You have published over 70 scholarly articles, I think even more. You've edited or co-edited 7 books, among which Companion to the Philosophy of Action, Emergence in Science and Philosophy, Downward Causation and the Neurobiology of Free Will, Agents, Causes, and Events, Essays on Indeterminism and Free Will, and written several books, including Persons and Causes, The Metaphysics of Free Will. And I think you're now writing, or even have finished now, another book for a broader audience, thinking about faith, philosophy, science, and Christian belief. On your website, you claim to be the Philo-Pong World Grand Champion, so the #1 of table tennis player among professional philosophers. So we're going to check this right now, okay? By listening to you, reasons and causes. So it's your turn, Tim.
Okay. Permettez-moi d'abord de remercier Claudine et Jean-Baptiste pour l'organisation de cette conférence et pour m'avoir invité à vous parler. All right, et now en anglais. I have been thinking about the nature of free will for the past 25 years. In very general terms, my position has remained the same, but my views on the details have slowly evolved in tandem with changes in the way I think about certain more basic metaphysical issues and about the nature of explanation. So I will begin today by sketching out an account of freely willed actions that represent my current way of thinking. I will then discuss 3 objections to my sort of view pressed recently by several authors. All of them center around what sorts of explanations are or are not possible for causally undetermined choices, and the implications for a person's control over and moral responsibility for such choices. I am a freedom determinism incompatibilist. Freedom of action is not compatible with its being true that for every event prior to the event, there is an objective probability of 1 that the event will occur. If, put differently, if we have some measure of freedom, it must be true that some of our choices, for some of our choices, there was a non-zero prior probability that we would choose differently. While it is plausible that sometimes our choices, and particularly those we make automatically, without deliberation and often without focal attention, are effectively causally determined, I also think that we make other choices where this is not the case, choices that are not causally determined strictly or approximately. For the sake of what follows, let us assume this conjunction of incompatibilism and causal indeterminism, the one an a priori philosophical thesis and the other an empirical claim. If it is indeed necessary for our sometimes acting freely and being morally responsible for the consequences of such actions, that they have been causally undetermined, very plausibly it is not sufficient. What must certain of our actions be like, then, if we are to be free and responsible agents? At this point, it is usual to distinguish event-causal and agent-causal approaches to freedom and to take a stand on which of these approaches is correct. Indeed, that sort of problematic informs much of what I have written about free will, but I have come to think it is a mistake. The problem with it is not specific to freedom, but stems from assumptions concerning causation quite generally. Event causal analyses of causation of some form or other have been popular ever since David Hume, and especially throughout the 20th century. With a growing number of recent philosophers, I now think that the general identification of causes with events is an unfortunate legacy of Hume's mistaken rejection of causal power and substance as basic metaphysical categories. Deflationary neo-Humean metaphysics remain popular. There are defenders of such an approach here in this room. But it is now being vigorously challenged by a broadly neo-Aristotelian alternative. On this alternative framework, the world is fundamentally a world of things or substances, not events. Events are the having of a power by an object. Accordingly, it is in general powerful particulars, objects that exercise or manifest causal power. All causation is object or substance causation. To be sure, objects acting in the ways that they do have explanations. They reflect the causal powers that they have at the time, powers that are none other than one or more natural properties that they have. And typically, they reflect also the presence of external necessary manifestation conditions. Only typically, since the phenomena of radioactive particle decay seems to involve no manifestation conditions. It's a purely internal process, impervious to the environmental context in which the substance is placed. But that's an extraordinary case. So, for example, two electrons mutually repel each other. That is, cause each other to move along receding paths at a decelerating rate of velocity as a function of their distance. They do so in virtue of their powers, that is, their common negative electric charge, and in the circumstance, necessary manifestation condition, of there being a certain distance apart with no significant countervailing forces acting upon them. I said that the natural properties of objects are causal powers. Here, I refer to those fundamental intrinsic features of objects that make for objective similarity. For an electron, such properties will be determinate magnitudes of charge, mass, spin, and magnetic momentum. For a human person, such natural properties will include such properties as believing, desiring, and intending various things. In some possible cases, given the totality of properties had by an object and those had by its environment, the effect is causally determined to occur. The conjunction of interacting powers, you might say, yields a probability of 1 that the substance or substances will cause that very type of effect. In other possible cases, the effect is causally undetermined. Here, the exercise of more than one power is possible, and plausibly, naturally possible consistent with the laws of nature. And plausibly, each of these distinct propensities is probable to some specific degree. Every undetermined, indeterministic event is produced by a cause on this picture, though none is necessitated. I think it's a mistake to describe indeterministic situations as saying events occur without causes. No, every event has a cause, it's just that none are necessitated. Let us then consider the case of a human person's choice that we're assuming is causally undetermined. Since we are trying to model free will, let us suppose a case where the agent consciously decides between options while being aware of those factors, or at least many of them, that incline her towards each of the alternative possibilities she contemplates. These will include desires and aims that she has, and beliefs concerning how she might attempt to realize those aims, her chances of success, and so on. In short, her relevant motivating reasons, or as I might put it in what follows, simply her reasons. As all behavior is motivated behavior, absent those or other motivating states, she would not have the power to choose the corresponding action. Motivating states confer powers. To be in a motivating state just is to have a power to act in at least some possible situation. Whether or not you are able to exercise that power at a particular time and in a particular context depends on the causal structure that results from the various powers in and around you, on what that total structure does or does not permit to occur. Where you are able, in the circumstances, to act in more than one way at some future time t, there will be evolving objective prior probabilities of your so choosing in each of those ways. Evolving in response to your own continued deliberation, or perhaps just to the lessened salience to you of some alternative, or to a relevant change in your environment that was itself not predetermined to occur. What is it then, on this picture of free action, what is it then to act on a particular reason, R? Here you can see the handout. Put otherwise, the question is, what is it for the fact of your having had a motivating reason, R, to explain your choosing and acting as you do? On the account I propose, your having reason, R, explains your actual choice simply if it was among the factors that contributed positively to the prior probability of your making that choice throughout an interval that terminates in the choice itself. But this is consistent with its influence being wholly unconscious. We might want to capture a stronger way that reasons can explain actions. One way is to say that you act for, this is just some stipulative terminology I'm introducing, and this also is on your handout. So we might say that you act for reason R if you act on reason R, and you were consciously aware of having that reason at the time of the choice. In summary, and again see your handout, on the account I now favor, an agent acts freely and is a locus of moral responsibility in the basic desert sense if, 1, he is a conscious and rational substance with the general power to choose actions in accordance with his own motivations. 2, he has at any given time more specific powers to choose particular courses of action that are grounded mostly in some of his motivational states that run the gamut from momentary desires to long-range life aims. 3, his choices are frequently causally undetermined just prior to the moment of choice. And finally, he exercises that power in conscious awareness of some or all of the motivational states that ground his power specifically to choose as he does. I likewise contend that where these conditions obtain, the agent's choosing as he does is rationally explained by the motivational states that ground his power so to choose. I spoke of that powers being mostly grounded in those states to simultaneously recognize that our conscious awareness of influences on us is not and need not be total, yet also to recognize that too much significant, wholly subpersonal causal influence is freedom diminishing, or perhaps in some cases even undermining. All right, with this basic account on the table, I now consider 3 different objections to it. First objections has to do with the idea of objective probabilities governing action and whether or not this undermines control. So in a recent book, our very own Dirk Pereboom argues that supposing agent causal power is governed by objective probabilities undermines responsibility conferring control. To persuade us of this claim, he invites us to imagine that God creates beings who have two fundamental propensities, one for self-interest and one for morality. I think he was recently reading Anselm or something, maybe, when he thought of this idea. And we're to suppose that these propensities are equal and inalterable. Okay? They incline you equally in one of two directions. And the propensities don't change over time. He notes that we should expect, if all of this is so, we should expect that over the course of a lifetime, roughly half of an agent's decisions involving a conflict of self-interest and morality would be self-interested, and the other half would be moral. He takes it to be evident that in such a scenario, agents do not have the right sort of control over their choices to be morally responsible in the basic desert sense. Anticipating correctly that some will object on the grounds that it's the inalterability of the probabilities that is control sapping in his scenario, and that this is an unnecessary feature of indeterministic choice, he then constructs a more complex case. In this revised case, he says, God adds a law that says that there is a 50% probability that at some point over each agent's lifetime, the agent will in some way cause her own moral conversion, such that from that point onward, all of her decisions will be moral. You got the scenario? There's a 50% chance that at some point you will do something that will cause your own moral conversion, so then you become resolutely moral, and then all future choices, when self-interest conflicts with moral considerations, you always go with the moral option. So we would expect in this revised scenario that about 50% of the agents will undergo such moral conversion, while the others do not. Here too, he thinks, when we focus on the objective probabilities in play that make likely in advance a certain kind of complex distribution in choice outcomes over the whole population, even though individual choices are left completely open, we doubt that the right sort of control is operative. The right sort of responsibility control is operative. Well, Pereboom simply describes his cases and pronounces his judgment. But I share, to a significant degree, his sense that there is something wrong in these scenarios, freedom-wise. And he himself puts his finger on the problem when discussing his first scenario. But he seems to me to fail to recognize, one, that the same problem carries over to the second scenario and to more complicated variations on it that we could devise, and three, that it is wholly an artifact of his particular non-mandatory way of modeling indeterminist choice. The problem that I'm referring to is that Pereboom's agents do not continuously change in small or big ways as a result of their individual choices. So if I'm one of Pereboom's creatures, pick an arbitrary point in my life. I have a choice, say, between helping my daughter with her schoolwork or drinking beer with my friends at a pub. I choose the pub, sadly. A couple days later, the particulars vary, but I have a structurally similar choice. And again, I pursue the self-interested option. In real life, we'd think, careful, you're starting to form a bad habit there. But not in Pereboom's world. A string of 10 self-interested or moral choices in a row is unlikely, but where it happens, I'm not tilted in that direction, not even a bit. Nor do I learn from my own experience. Whatever reflection I do upon my weirdly balanced psychology makes no difference either. We might say more about what exactly is freedom undermining in this picture, but we'd first need to hear more about how the probabilities are psychologically embedded, such that they are impervious to alteration in any of these ways that we're all familiar with in our own case. Paraboom's agents are very different from us in not being impacted by their choices, their experience of the consequences of their choices, or the occasional self-reflection. Supposing this is even possible, for there to be agents psychologically structured in this way, if we wanted to have a generally applicable account of responsibility conferring control, we could I could augment the account that I offered by requiring such dynamical change in response to past choices, experiences, and reflection. There is no worry, it seems to me, that human agents would not meet such a condition. Okay, a second objection. On my view, an agent's deciding to do A consists in the agent's causing an executive intention to A. That is, an intention to do A immediately, right now. That's how I think of following Al Mealy, of what it is to choose something. Where this is a free decision, there was a non-negligible prior probability that the agent would cause an intention to B instead. So on my picture, this is very abstract, but it's basically saying when I act freely, the beginning of my action is constituted by my causing a state of intention in myself that, in the normal case, ushers in the behavior immediately. But there was some prior probability of my having formed an incompatible such intention to do something else instead. Dana Nelkin and Neil Levy both argue that such a scenario precludes anything more than a weak or defective kind of rational explanation of the choice the agent makes. And perhaps, they suggest, it allows for no real explanation at all. So they think there's something peculiar here. It has to do with this significant indeterminism, such that we can't explain why the agent chose as she did. And then, of course, the thought is, if we cannot rationally explain why the agent chose as she did, this is going to suggest there's something defective about the control the agent is exercising over her own action. So Levy puts the charge as follows, and it's in a book that I list at the bottom of your handout. If the agent decides to do some action A where action B was really possible, then the pro-A set of motivations can explain only why A was being considered by the agent and why A was a causally open possibility. That exhausts their explanatory power in my scenario, he suggests. To explain the choice of A itself, we would need to cite a factor that contrastively explains why the agent chose A rather than B. But the problem is that where there is significant indeterminism, there cannot be contrastive explanation. A contrastive explanation would indicate why, given all the relevant factors, all the relevant influences that are at play, A was selected rather than B. But ex hypothesi, those factors tug in different directions, and no subset of factors dominate the others as would be needed for contrastive explanation. He concludes it was simply a matter, in the scenario I'm envisioning, it would simply be a matter of chance, of good or bad luck, that A was chosen on this occasion, rather than its being something firmly under the agent's control. I think that this objection is correct in thinking that sheer inexplicability is inconsistent with agential control. If it were true that someone described a scenario where there's no possibility of explanation for what the agent does, then the agent could not thereby have control. But I think the objection is wrong to assume that contrastive explanation is some kind of gold standard, or even the only standard of explanation. We often desire and uncover different kinds of explanation. But when we ask for a contrastive explanation, again, where contrastive explanations have the form why A rather than B, we defeasibly presume, to ask that very question, why A rather than B, presumes something. It presumes that there is an explanatory relationship between what happened, A, and what failed to occur, all right? And so the fact that not B, right? It assumes there's some deep connection between A and not B in the scenario, explanatory connection. That is, we presume that the occurrence of A and the non-occurrence of B can be given a unifying explanation. But even in a deterministic world, this will not be the case for every pair of items, as not everything that happens is deeply explanatorily connected to everything else. Okay, so there won't be a good contrastive explanation for why is it the case that we are sitting here and there is not a meteorite now striking the earth, causing the death of us all. Okay, that's a why A rather than B, but we can assume the world is deterministic. There is no satisfactory answer to that question. That contrastive question there's a presumption built into the question that is false. And there's nothing mysterious about the fact that there is no explanation of that contrastive fact. But non-contrastive explanations of particular phenomena are also possible. And I'm wanting to say contrastive explanations are one kind of explanation, but there can also be non-contrastive explanations. We can give an answer why A that's not an answer to the question why A rather than B. Those are distinct questions, okay? And in indeterministic scenarios of any kind, for certain purposes, these are the sole proper sort of explanation to seek. In general, an outcome of an indeterministic scenario is adequately explained by identifying the object or coordinated system of objects that produced the outcome, identifying the features of the object that gave it the power to produce the outcome, and finally identifying the total circumstance in virtue of which there was a non-zero probability of its doing so. An explanation that cites such factors can be perfectly adequate, even though there is no explanation of why this result was produced rather than that one, whose probability of occurring was likewise non-zero. Indeed, in such a scenario, we have an explanation of why there cannot be a correct contrastive explanation of the outcome for every possible contrast. The very nature of an indeterministic causal agent precludes such explanations. Okay? And this has nothing to do with free will. It's just indeterministic activity in general. It perhaps helps to demystify indeterministic causal activity to think of deterministic causes as simply the limit case of analogous indeterministic causes arranged on a continuum, ordered by the strength of their antecedent probability to cause the actual outcome. Indeterministic causes, whether in basic physics or in human behavior, are not substandard causes, and there is nothing partial or otherwise defective about the non-contrastive explanations of them that accurate theoretical descriptions would provide. Nothing pertaining to the target phenomena will be left out of good non-contrastive explanations of them. Which events occur, how they are produced, and whether and why specific type of alternative events were possible, even though non-actual, given the prior circumstances. Now, Nelkin and others will say that even if what I've just said is accepted, it's hard to see how agents acting indeterministically provides, quote, provides a unique kind of control, not exercised by otherwise similar agents acting deterministically, right? The suggestion is, okay, so if there's not some special kind of power, why, what sort of enhanced control is being conferred upon an agent by supposing that her activity is non-deterministic? And if it does not confer some enhanced form of control, why think that indeterminism is a necessary condition on the kind of rational control that constitutes free will? While talk of enhanced control, that I myself have indulged in previous work, talk of enhanced control and its denial makes sense when we are contrasting agent and event causal accounts of freedom, a contrast that the neo-Aristotelian metaphysics obliterates by saying all causation is substance causation. It seems cloudy to me in this framework, right? What we who believe that indeterminism is a necessary condition on freedom can clearly say is that indeterministic agents, but not their deterministic counterparts, are able to choose otherwise, taking into account all causal constraints under which they operate. They have, and their deterministic counterparts lack, the power to form different choices than the ones they do, for good or bad. Not just a general power to do so, but the power to do so in the very circumstances they are in. And having this power is important to moral responsibility, whether or not we judge it appropriate to say it involves an enhanced variety of control. So I recommend we drop talk of enhanced control because we don't need to argue the advantages of an agent causal over an event causal indeterministic account of agency. All right, final objection. We enter the world with, sorry, let me check my time here. Good.
It's fine, you're fine.
All right. We enter the world with powerful and deep behavioral and attitudinal dispositions. Long before we mature to the point of making sophisticated reflective choices, we are placed in environments that mold and add to those dispositions. As we come of age, these factors largely determine that Joanna, say, will choose from only a very limited range of options in any given situation, a range that will differ quite a bit from what perhaps Helen would consider were she placed in similar circumstances. And in many cases, these pre-given factors that we had no say in, that shape our basic orientation to the world, heavily influence our choices themselves, even if they do not causally determine all of them. These early choices and continuing contingencies of circumstance, in turn, will sharply circumscribe the options that Joanna considers at a more reflective stage, when we begin to hold her accountable for her actions. A certain kind of free will and/or moral responsibility skeptic concludes from reflections such as these that debate over indeterminist agency is really a sideshow. Even if the sort of account I have sketched describes some human behavior, it is not, nor could it ever be, enough, since factors unchosen by Joanna largely account for the kinds of deliberation and the overall pattern of outcomes of her mature choices. While she may have a small measure of freedom of choice, she lacks, you might say, autonomy in a robust way, and thereby lacks deep moral responsibility. In response to this objection, one must concede that responsibility for shaping who I am and for the choices that ensue from this comes in degrees, and indeed can only sensibly be measured within a limited scope of possibilities for me. We cannot hold Joanna responsible for failing to consider an option entirely outside the range of her experience, and her responsibility for ignoring options which are within the range of her experience, but which she has had precious little opportunity to consider as attractive options, is attenuated. In concrete cases, given limited information, we hazard rough guesses on these matters when we make moral judgments concerning one another. When we are confronted with an individual who quite deliberately and unhesitatingly makes, say, a grossly immoral choice, indeed who seems not to even consider the obvious moral alternative, the question one needs to ask is this: was there a point earlier in his life when paths were open to him, ones for which at each step of the way he had some significant motivation to pursue, and which he recognized as having moral significance, such that had he taken them, or some of them, he would now be such as to see the force of the moral considerations at hand? How difficult would it have been for him to pursue such a path? Our guesses about such matters are exceedingly rough and rely on the assumption that a certain measure of rough moral sensitivity is had by most mature human individuals. Absent compelling information to the contrary, then, we deem it appropriate to hold individuals responsible for their own moral indifference. Moreover, we may consistently suppose that there are individuals whose basic choice-making capacities, you might say, are just like ours, but who are largely insensitive to considerations of basic human decency through no fault of their own. And we can also accept that total responsibility for one's choices and character is not just contingently lacking in human beings, it is an impossible notion. For it would seem to require perfect indifference at the outset, or at least an openness to all possible courses of action, having some motivational inclination towards all possible courses of actions. The coherence of that idea is very doubtful. Even when we set aside such extreme cases involving horrendous childhood abuse, biologically rooted deficiencies in moral cognition, and the like, we need to recognize that as creatures of habit and settled psychological dispositions, our autonomy is a highly fragile thing. For some of us, it's plausible that early patterns of choices lead in foreseeable ways to character and life outcomes in such a way that the person reasonably thinks, I have had a significant role to play in my becoming who I am. But for others, early choices cause them to fixate on certain goals rashly, without their having foreseen or intended this consequence. And they come in middle age to think of themselves as trapped in a persona and pattern of life that feels imprisoning, diminishing rather than enhancing their future freedom over time. There is, in short, an element of luck in whether we fall into one or another of these categories. And the upshot seems to be that some come to have a greater measure of what we might term diachronic moral autonomy than others. And this difference will not consistently track the degree of proper praiseworthiness or blameworthiness. This is a disquieting, even tragic reality, but I do not see that it warrants generalized skepticism concerning moral responsibility. Thanks.